I am Carrie Wimberly. I'm the Executive Director of the Addiction Prevention Coalition. So I just want to welcome you guys. Thank you so much for joining us. This is a continuation of a prevention webinar series that we're doing with 6 other partners in the state of Alabama, prevention organizations and coalitions coming together to provide these webinars once a month during the school year. So we are excited today to offer a webinar on underage drinking alcohol prevention called Teens and Alcohol Prevention, Resetting Norms and Narratives. It's my pleasure to introduce you, if you haven't already met, Dr. Aaron Weiner from Lake Forest, Illinois. He is a board certified practicing psychologist, former healthcare system administrator, consultant, public speaker, and community educator, specializing in addiction, psychology, and behavioral health. That's a mouthful. But his passion is to bridge the gap between scientific medical journals and the real world, making complicated and specialized information about addiction accessible and actionable for groups of any type. And I have to just put a personal plug in right here. If you are on LinkedIn and have not connected with him there, I would encourage you to do so. He does exactly that, reads journals and articles and then puts them in a way that is easy to understand and publishes that. He also has a blog, a video blog, a podcast, a website, and there's so much wonderful data there that we continue to use and republish on our site and use for our training. So encourage people to do that. So thank you so much, Dr. Weiner, for doing this presentation for us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Well, that's awfully kind, and thank you. And thank you everyone for coming, and for those watching this as a recording, appreciate you tuning in. I'm going to just quickly steal the spotlight, literally and figuratively, I suppose, over to me here so that when I share my screen, it looks proper. So let's go ahead. I'm going to pull up my slides and we'll just get rolling because we actually have a good chunk to talk about today. We are going to talk about teen alcohol use, about the norms, and about how to have conversations about it. I think information is important, but knowing what to do with it is also critical. Otherwise, it only really takes you so far. So hopefully you'll leave today feeling like you learned some things that you didn't know before, but then also can take that information and put it to good use. If you have questions, we should have some time at the end of the day today to answer those. And so you're welcome to just stick them either in the chat or the Q&A. Happy to review those at the end. I'll pitch things back over to Carrie to facilitate that. Or if you'd like to raise your hand, you should have a little button on the bottom where you can raise your hand when we're at the Q&A at the end. And if you're feeling brave, we can unmute you, and you can just ask it verbally, which is completely okay too. But if all that fails, or you just think of something down the line, or if you're watching this as a recording, my email is down here in the bottom left, aaron@weinerphd.com, and you are more than welcome to reach out to me there or on LinkedIn. I try to be very, very responsive because I think that information and knowledge to take action with is everything. And so I really like to be that bridge as much as I can. So all that being said, we do have a bit to talk about. So let's go ahead and get to it. I'm going to start with the part that I think is a little bit more dry, which is the statistics. You just get that out of the way, but I still think it can be interesting. We actually just recently had the data published in terms of the National Survey of Drug Use and Health, or NSDUH for short. Which is where we get all of our national statistics. So the 2003 numbers were just released. And right now, what the data shows is that alcohol is the most used substance right now by teenagers, leading nicotine products, which is predominantly vaping right now for youth, and then also marijuana. And despite all that, right, we don't talk about alcohol very much, and we will unpack that idea of norms in just a couple minutes about why that might be the case, that we tend to not talk about it as much, but it is actually still the most prevalent. That being said, and we will come back to this quite a few times as well during our presentation today, I want you to look at how low this number really is, which is a good thing, right? When you're looking at that number, it is 14.6%. And granted, this is a larger age range, right, from 12 to 20, and we tend to focus more on, like, when we talk about teenagers, right, 13 to 17. But that is not 50%. That is not 60%. That is not even 40%. That's a lot. That's actually a lot lower. And so this is past month use that we're looking at here in the past month. So it's worth noting that there's big gaps between what kids think other kids are doing and what other kids are actually doing. Everyone seems to think that everyone is drinking or vaping or smoking THC products, and that is just simply not the case. And helping them understand that is going to be one of those the core concepts today of how much leverage we can get from doing some renorming. Just a little bit more data from this very recent release. This was in the past couple of months from from SAMHSA nationally. Is that girls are actually drinking more than boys right now as well in terms of past month alcohol use, but it's around the same, right? It's all circling around that median, which is 14.6. Now, in terms of its impact, so it's hard sometimes. I've got some youth numbers coming up in the next slide, but I want to just broaden out to talk about what the substance is actually doing in our country as a whole. It actually is related, depending on where you look in the government, between 140,000 to 180,000 alcohol-related deaths every single year. And that comes down to about 380 deaths per day. It is the third leading cause of preventable death. And actually, it's gone way, way up even before the pandemic, where it increased by another 25% over the year, over the COVID years. But this was a chart I know that really stuck out to me when I saw it the first time. This is just looking at all ages increase in alcohol related death. And, the minimum was 15% in certain parts of the country, right? And it goes all the way up to almost doubling in other parts, right? So this is an issue that is actually very prominent, very important. And they did get 25% worse over even what you're seeing here over the course of the pandemic. Yet we don't talk about it too much. Like, we certainly don't talk about it as much as, fentanyl and opioids. There's just another article about that written, opinion piece that was released by the New York Times recently. And, for good reason, right? There's a opioid epidemic going on. That's, the opioids part of it alone, I think right now, largely driven by fentanyl, is about 90,000 deaths a year. But, there's about twice as many dying from alcohol, and we don't talk about an alcohol epidemic, but that's actually where we're at. It's related to 40% of all driving fatalities. It's the most impactful human cause on fatalities and kills 36 people every single day. It's responsible for 40% of all violent crime and 66% of domestic abuse cases and 50% of all sexual assaults. So that's a lot, when you really think about it in terms of what happens when people drink heavily and or regularly, what that can do to you. Now, in terms of alcohol and youth, which is of course really where we're aiming our focus today, we'll talk a bit about the health side, but just from a numbers standpoint, 90% of the alcohol that kids consume, they tend to consume in binge drinking episodes, which, the technical definition of that for adults is 4 or more for females and 5 or more for males in a drinking episode. But when we're talking about teenagers who have smaller bodies, that shifts a little bit. It's not quite as we got to think a little bit differently about it. But 90% is from a binge drinking episode, so which is when you tend to see the most harm because you're really overusing the substance very much in that time. At those times. In 2011, 188,000 people under 21 went to the ER for alcohol-related injuries. And there's an increased risk of alcohol problems later in life when kids use it at a younger age. So there was a study that came out recently that found that adults who began drinking before the age of 15 are 3.5 times more likely to report having past year alcoholism than those who waited to be 21 until they started. It actively interferes with brain development as well. And we'll talk a lot more about the health side of things as we get a little bit further in the presentation today. But it's definitely not a value add, and it's not benign. And actually, even small amounts aren't necessarily, certainly they don't have the negative impact that large amounts do, but it's also still not helpful. Particularly when your brain is still developing and it's not done forming until about the age of 25 to 28, you really want to let it just do its work in peace. You don't want to be putting chemicals up there that can change how it's going to. It grows in some places, it prunes in some others, and you kind of want to just let it do its thing. And the moment you start introducing chemicals in there, you start changing how the brain functions and sometimes the structure as well. And again, we'll get more into those specifics, but it's not a value add. Now, that being said, kids do think that it is. And there's a few reasons for this because alcohol, so from a health standpoint, it might not be a value add, but there are potentially benefits to using it, or kids perceive them to be benefits anyway, in the short term. And when you ask kids specifically why, like when you do these surveys and you ask about their motivations, there are three main areas that pop up. One has to do with external stressors. And right now, it's never been a more challenging time to be a young person. And we'll talk about the mental health issues in just a minute. But just thinking about all the pressures, right? Like there's never been more pressure to succeed at school, to go to college, to get good grades. They've got to deal with cyberbullying and all, the issue of sexual predators and everything that can be waiting for them online. Social media. Recently, the Surgeon General said that he thinks there should be a black box warning on social media platforms because of how much they hurt children, which I think is a justified request. And school shootings have just gone through the roof in terms of frequency in the past 5 to 10 years. And all of these things very stressful for young people. And they've got to try to figure out a way to deal with it. So you've got the external, then you also have the internal in terms of dealing with depression, dealing with anxiety, dealing with trauma, trying to figure out, I've got these feelings and I don't know what to do about it. And it seems like when I drink here, it takes those feelings away. But then the extra layer that's particularly strong for young people, adolescents and young adults, is the social side of things, which isn't to say that social factors don't matter to adults as well. Absolutely, they do. But when you are in this period of your life, what you're trying to do is figure out who you are, who you're not, who you want to hang out with, how you define yourself. And so if you had been hanging out previously with a group of other kids and now they're all drinking and vaping and doing all these sorts of things, it's very hard for you to sit on the outside and to say, I'm not going to do that, but I still want to be your friend. Even if there's not explicit peer pressure, there's a lot of conformity pressure, right? Of wanting to fit in, FOMO, those sorts of things that push you towards it. Alternatively, if you have a young person who's wanting to connect with a new group of kids, it's very difficult to do that if they're the only one who's not drinking, if they're the only one who's not participating. And so there's this extra layer of pressure and of peer influence and peer norms that we'll talk about as well. Now, that being said, there are potentially a lot of pitfalls that come from drinking, and particularly if you've got a young person who's drinking a lot, you might be asking yourself, like, as a parent in particular, like, why do they keep doing this? Why are they drinking? What keeps bringing them back? And the principle that I want to bring up here, that we'll come back to as we go along, is that behavior is always purpose driven, even if it doesn't seem to make sense on its face. There's always a reason why we do what we do. And if you're looking at someone else's behavior, young or old, but if you're looking at their behavior and you say to yourself, this just does not seem to make sense. It seems like they're acting against their best interest. That simply means there's something that they're getting from it that you don't know right now. And if you knew that thing, it actually would make sense. Furthermore, though, it's that thing that you don't know usually is emotional, not logical. It's emotional. And this gets down to the question, particularly again around substances, around drinking, that our brain works differently when we're stressed out or when we're feeling pressure than when we're feeling relaxed. And so to explain this a little bit better, I like to use this image on the next slide, which is like an anatomically correct picture of the human brain. And this is what it looks like on the inside. You got an electric car, and you got a dog sitting behind the wheel. And so I want to explain why I like this diagram of the human brain to explain how we operate under stress, because I think it really just boils down to a couple main factors. So you got the car and you got the dog. So let's talk about the car to start. So the car in this picture, this is a metaphor, of course, right? This is a metaphor for the prefrontal cortex, which is the car, and then the limbic system, which is the little dog. But let's start with the car. So our prefrontal cortex is our analytical side of our brain. That's the part where you can think critically about things and synthesize big ideas and moralize and think about long-term benefit over short-term gain, all that sort of stuff. It's what separates us from animals, because animals don't have that part of our brain. It's very advanced. But as advanced as that is, it is less powerful than our limbic system, our animal brain, the part that animals do have, which is the part of our brain that's responsible for urges and impulses and drives and emotions. And the thing about our limbic system is that what it wants more than anything else is to not experience pain and discomfort. That's like its, modus operandi. That is priority one. Don't feel pain. The second thing that it likes more than anything else is to experience pleasure. And so what happens is that when you get stressed out, when you get uncomfortable, your limbic system starts to kick in. And I like to call that the dog taking the wheel of the car. And the dog says, in our brain, right, our limbic system says, we need to feel better right now. We don't want to wait. We don't want to tolerate this distress. We don't want to sit with it. We want it to go away right this very instant. And when that's what you're looking for, substances can seem very appealing, because that's something that substances do, right? The intoxication takes away discomfort and can add some euphoria. Checks both of those boxes. And so particularly if you've trained it to do this before, if your brain already thinks like, hey, I'm feeling really stressed out today, I should get a drink, it's much more likely to go for that again. And the more uncomfortable you get, the stronger your limbic system grabs that wheel. If you look at brain scans, actually, of the way the brain functions, what you see is that the prefrontal cortex, when you do give someone like a stressful task where they're like, you basically, as stressful as just being in the fMRI would be, like you put them in that fMRI and you tell them to do a stressful task that's going to aggravate them. What you actually see is the activation of the prefrontal cortex decrease and the activity in the limbic system increase. That's why if you've ever been in a situation where you've been like say you're having some sort of disagreement, some argument with your significant other, and you get angry and you say something that you don't necessarily mean, or that's not very courteous or thoughtful, and that's hurtful, and that you probably wouldn't say in any other context because it might be mean or just hurtful, unkind, unconscientious. The reason though why that happens is that you're feeling uncomfortable, right? The other person maybe is getting a little bit aggressive, or you perceive disrespect or whatever it is, and you've got maybe some pressure inside that you're just discharging, right? You're just getting that pressure to go down, and it feels better. Or maybe you feel like, well, hey, if I get loud, maybe then they'll stop saying the things that hurt me, right? And then maybe I'll feel a little bit better. But whatever it is, it's about distress reduction in the moment. Because if you were thinking, right, remember that's the car. If you were fully thinking, you wouldn't do it because you love this person, and why would you say things that are hurtful? But you're not. And so what compounds this metaphor even a little bit further is that young people are not playing with a full deck of cards until they're 25 to 28, and the last part of your brain that develops is your prefrontal cortex. So they don't even have the same power in the car that adults do. And so when they get hit with that depression or that anxiety or that social pressure, it's a lot tougher for them to not fall down into that trap. They're just wired differently. And so all this comes back to the fact that unhealthy coping comes from discomfort. And here I'll take try to take my head. I can't take my head out of the way. All right. But unhealthy coping comes from discomfort. And so what I mean by this is that so you've got things like fury and clinical depression, panic attacks, chronic anxiety. When you talk about a feeling getting to kind of its ultimate low point, and what happens when it gets really low is that's when we start seeing these compensatory behaviors on the other side, like nervous tics or eating disorders or addictive behaviors like drinking, hoarding, compulsions, etc. That it all comes from just wanting to feel better, or to create, to be wanted, to be part of a group, to be valued, to feel important. We're generally very basic human and emotional needs, but the strategy, in this case drinking, the strategy that's being used to try to get there is not helpful. And that's where the problem comes from. So the issue now, when we lay on top of why are we concerned about youth drinking and what's some of the issue here, is that the mental health burden on kids has never been higher than it is right now. When you look at the current survey data, And actually, again, this is the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, national sample of high school students. And the data from 2023 just came out about 3-4 months ago. 2 in 5, 40% of students endorsed basically having clinical depression in the last year. But then 1 in 5, excuse me, seriously thought about suicide. 1 in 10 tried it. They attempted suicide, although only about a fifth of them make it to a doctor. So in this last row here is showing, the change between 2021 and 2023 and the directionality there. And I mean, I guess things got a little bit better on that top line, that they dropped from 42 to 40. But that's still really high, in my opinion. But those lower ones, though, around suicide, that really bothers me a lot. I guess, just to be honest with you. I mean, I think that if you're looking out like at a class of 30 students, and statistically speaking, 3 of them tried to kill themselves last year, that's a lot. That's really unfortunate, and says to me that there's a lot more we really need to be doing to try to support kids' mental health, so that hopefully they're not resorting to drinking. Just another way of looking at this, by the way, is that their brains, and we've been talking a bit about brain science this morning, their brains actually changed over the COVID years. So part of the reason why they're struggling so much has been what they've all gone through in that period of time with the pandemic. And essentially, like a 16-year-old's brain today looks different than a 16-year-old's brain did in 2019 or 2018. We see now that there's reduced cortical thickness, larger hippocampal and amygdala volume, and more advanced brain age. And that is not a good thing. That's not like you want more advanced brain age at an earlier age. That's not what we're looking at. So stress is a huge factor. And depression, mental health burden, when we talk about why do kids choose to drink, this is a big part of it. Now, another part, and this is, again, where we're going to spend just a little bit of time because this is an entry point for us, has to do with social norms. So social norms come in 2 flavors. There are descriptive norms and injunctive norms. A descriptive norm is what basically what you think other people are doing around you, just describing the environment, hence descriptive norms. So like, and we'll see an example of that on the next slide that we're about to get to, but just how many other kids, say, for example, do you think are drinking? An injunctive norm is, and how acceptable is that behavior to people? Like, am I doing something here that is condoned or celebrated or permitted, or am I doing something here that other people would find distasteful or unpleasant? And those are both of those things actually lead into substance use. And we're talking about alcohol today, but the same thing is true for things like smoking versus vaping. Like, there's a reason, right, why a lot more kids right now are vaping rather than smoking. And some of it has to do with the flavors and all that, but a lot of it also has to do with these injunctive norms, where right now smoking is not cool for kids, but in some circles vaping is cool for kids. Right. And so you wouldn't necessarily think about smoking because that goes against that injunctive norm. So those are the 2 areas where we can influence teens, and not just from friends, actually, as well. It can be from family. And we'll talk about that as well. So I want to share with you, this is some local data that I got my hands on a little while ago from where I'm at here in Chicago. So this might not exactly represent where you guys are, but I want to share it as data maybe that you can pull, or just to show you, because this, I think, is representative if you look at national data as well. So what you're looking at here, these are a number of different counties in Illinois. I was at a conference for a regional conference where we pulled this data, and what you're looking at here is for alcohol. How many, and this is how many high school students, I believe this is the seniors actually, their perception of harm. So what is the harm of binge drinking? You can see that's actually fairly high. A lot of them felt like that it was moderate or a great risk. But take a look at these 2 columns here of perception of peer use versus actual. And what this is representing is not just straight up. The column on the left is saying what percentage of students thought that over 50% of other students drank. So what percentage of students thought that 50% of all students drink? And you can see here actually that that number is almost 50% of kids think that most kids drink. This column here on the right, though, is the actual percentage of students who drink. So all of the kids here in this left column, which is about half, think that over 50% of kids are drinking, and virtually it's under 20% in most of those, well, actually, maybe it's right around 20%. It's probably the average between them. But no, it's not over 50, not even close, right? It's not 50, 60, 65, 52, even 48. There's this one county here that looks like it's up at 34%, but it's pretty low. The kids are very much out of touch about that. The other column that I want to draw your attention to, and we'll come back to this as well in a little bit, is this accessing with parents' permission column. And what we'll talk about in a minute actually is that the data is very strongly against doing this, right? About giving alcohol to your children. Technically speaking, actually, it's against the law in many places in the country. But even if it's not unlawful to do it, it's very common, and it is actually detrimental. And look at that in comparison to retail, by the way. So it's actually a lot tougher for kids to get access to this if parents don't give it. Now, in terms of the norms, right? So this to me says a lot about norms and understanding, like, just how do kids drink, or what's normal, quote unquote, for kids to do. What we're seeing here is those descriptive norms being way off, and maybe the injunctive as well. Part, though, about the injunctive side that I just want to highlight is that there's a lot of work that's done by companies to make alcohol use just be part of the fabric of our life, and even sometimes align it with youth in a way. So like recently, Mountain Dew actually came out with their own line of hard beverages. And these don't have caffeine in them. More on caffeine and alcohol in a minute, and why that's not a good idea from a health standpoint. But Mountain Dew is used primarily by young people, by high schoolers and college students. So leveraging this brand for a new type of hard beverage is really catering directly towards an audience that was most harmed by consuming them. It's not helpful. Now, another way, just to, again, to kind of shine a light on the disparity of these norms, this article surprisingly still incredibly relevant, even though it was written numerous years ago now. I'd encourage you to Google it. It was published online on Vox. Imagine if the media covered alcohol like other drugs. And so it's kind of a parody piece, but using real data. Meet alcohol, the drug making people run around nude and collapse in the streets. And it talks about actually like how destructive this is, but the media definitely covers and talks about the dangers of lots of things, but not so much about alcohol, nor the industry. Another thing that I think a lot of young people are unaware of, or just when we think about how we perceive, again, just norms and culture of alcohol companies. There was a study that came out a little while ago that was looking at who consumes, like how much are people consuming in America by decile, and how much is that? And actually, the vast majority of all alcohol is consumed by the people who are binge drinking or have alcoholism. So if you look at this, 90% of all alcohol is consumed by the top 20%. And actually, I believe the number is 80% is consumed by the very top decile, who drinks on average over 10 drinks per day. You could not have Anheuser-Busch or Coors without alcoholism. If everyone actually drank responsibly, they would go out of business, because this is where, I mean, look at how much of their business is just in these two categories compared with everything else. Additionally, about a third of all adults don't drink. And you can see that if you go up to about half, this is the amount of drinks someone has in an average week. Half of all Americans basically barely drink at all, most weeks. And, we're not even up to one drink a week by the time we get to the sixth decile. On average. So it's not, I think, what young people realize it is. And even just in terms of the dynamics of all of this, I'm not sure it's even what adults think it is. Now, why norms matter and why we're talking about this today is that social norms are some of the strongest predictors of teen alcohol use and binge drinking that there are. When you look at the data and you start to parse this apart, and there's been a lot that's been written about it, social norms are far and away the most important factor to account for. And there are four primary sources where these come from, We're going to talk about each today and what we can do about it. We got parents, we've got peers, we've got media, and then we have social media. And each of these has the ability to provide norms in either direction, right? Both either in a direction where we're norming behaviors that are safer and healthier, or we're norming behaviors that are more chaotic and risky, right? In terms of what it leads in someone's life. So let's talk first about the household. So parental and household norms. So first question you got to ask yourself as a parent is, what is being explicitly said about alcohol? Have you talked with them about it? And a phrase, it's probably coming maybe even later on the slide. I forget where I put this bullet. But this is something ideally that you talk about and talk about fairly regularly so that it becomes it's not like a big taboo topic where it feels super awkward to talk about. And we'll talk about conversation strategies a little bit later, but where it's just like you're just checking in. Like, what are you seeing in your friend group? What are you seeing at school? Is this around? You know, so that it's not something like all of a sudden you're like coming down on them or having a talk, or they've never talked with you about it before. So making sure that you are very explicit about not only just knowing what's going on, but also your expectations. Because, again, I think I repeat this on another slide, but parental expectations are one of the strongest predictors of youth behavior, actually. I know a lot of parents don't think that's the case, and maybe that's not the case for your child. Certainly that's possible. But statistically speaking, when we start looking at parental attitudes, how much parents have expressed those attitudes, and then child behavior, there's very clear relationships there. So making sure that you express what your expectations are, in terms of what the behavior you'd like to see out of your child, and that you have those talks, while still also being safe to talk to if they do drink or if something happens. And again, more on that in a minute. Supervised introduction to alcohol, including if they're just having sips of another drink, has been consistently shown to be detrimental to long-term alcohol-related outcomes in the research. It just simply, this is one of these things where a lot of times parents think, I would rather them have their first experiences with me, do it at home. I would rather be the one to give it to them. But this actually is harmful, is what we were finding from the research. Like, this is not, if this is something that you've done, you don't have to, like, there's not that there's a fire, but it's something where if it's something that you would consider doing in the future, if you haven't done, strongly suggest you not to do it because of what it's associated with. What it tends to do is normalize alcohol use, right? It creates this permission structure in the young person's brain that this is something that they can maybe even expect to do as a high schooler or expect to do underage while at college, that you are in some way endorsing it and acknowledging that's going to happen. So it normalizes that use. It's been linked to both quantity and frequency of use, risky drinking behavior, having alcohol-related problems, and just higher levels of alcohol use in teens if they have a supervised introduction to alcohol at home. So it's actually not a value add. It might seem like it on its surface. There's like this theoretical benefit to doing it, but the data actually goes in the direct opposite direction from doing that. So you need to also ask yourself, what relationship to alcohol is being modeled at the house, right? So are you, when your child is watching you, right? Are you saying like, man, I really need a drink. It's been a rough day. And starting to put that idea into their head that what you do at the end of a rough day is you drink, or that you drink to relax. Are you engaging with alcohol in front of them in unhealthy ways? In fact, actually, there's some solid research that indicates ideally you don't drink certainly to any extent, significant extent, but don't even drink in front of kids at all if you have the ability to do that, like for the vast majority of the time. Because even if you think about it, right, if this is something that they're seeing at special events, they're going to start to think, oh, it's a special event. We drink at special events. I should drink at special events, right? And so then that starts to translate then to parties and high school parties and drinking underage at college. They just start to pick up on those norms. So it's something where if you can minimize as much as possible how much you drink in front of your kids, that is helpful. And studies have indicated that children are also aware of how intoxicated a parent is. They know that they're drinking. And particularly if you are drinking to the point of intoxication, they see that as well. And 1 in 5 kids say that they've been embarrassed by their parents drinking at some point in time. when you ask teenagers about this. So this is something where they absolutely are watching, and the behaviors that we exhibit matter a lot in terms of outcomes. So talking about the media side for a second, there is a very clear positive association between media exposure and use of alcohol. And this is something I forgot to cite my source in the bottom of the slide here. I apologize. But there's quite a few studies that I drew this from, including a recent systematic review. But this can be from both explicit like advertisements, like if they are seeing in media. So when I say media, we're going to talk about social media in a second. But this is more about like actual media. So like streaming shows or television, that sort of thing. So it can either be actual like explicit advertisements or messages where they're being, like it's being actively promoted, or it can just be implicit where you're watching something happen. So and it's not necessarily that attention is being drawn to it. So like one example of explicit messaging is Euphoria, if you've seen this show. Particularly the first season, I think really, and it's worth mentioning, this is not meant for children. A lot of kids are watching it, a lot of teenagers are watching it, but it's not rated for children. But this is something where there's just a lot of very explicit drug use that's the center of the story in many ways as well. An example of something more implicit would be things like Stranger Things, where you've got people just smoking all over the place all the time. It's just like basically shown as like this is just a part of being an adult, is that you smoke cigarettes. Is basically kind of what the show is implicitly stating, which was the case back when the show was set. It was a lot more common than it is right now, but it's modeling that behavior again for kids. We've also seen the quantity of exposure to alcohol drinking in media matters, where teens with higher exposure, in one study, were over 2.4 times more likely to drink than those with minimal exposure. So what they're seeing and what they're watching absolutely matters. On the social media side, this is also, again, very consistent results. I have one study up here that I'm highlighting where they were looking at social media, like the sentiment, positive or negative, for different substances on social media platforms. And you can see here that for alcohol, there's less mention of it in this particular data set, but it was almost 92% positive to only 8% negative in terms of what kids are seeing and picking up on when folks are talking about alcohol online. So it tends to be very, very skewed in a positive direction, which is the case, by the way, for most drugs, tobacco, cannabis, e-cigarettes, even poly substance use. The only one that's negative more than it's positive is opioids. But even that is somehow still 40% positive. So they're getting a lot of pro substance use messages on social media. Just a couple other thoughts about this. There's been studies. This has been pretty extensively studied, actually, that exposure to pro drinking posts on Facebook are related to alcohol use, as well as having more binge drinking episodes. There's also a study that found they were looking at the amount of time that young people were exposed to these types of images online and then how much they were drinking. This was a study actually out of Norway, and found that for every hour on average per day they were exposed to this type of imagery, their chances of drinking as a teenager went up by 12% for each hour that they were viewing content that included this in it. So it's absolutely related. Again, getting back to that black box warning, but they're soaking in all of this positive messaging, and it absolutely makes a difference. Now, there's also just elements in terms of what kids need to know about these substances that they're just not aware of. Alcohol and caffeine is really a key core area where there's been a lot of misunderstanding amongst youth for a long time. That's why, if you remember Four Loko when it came out, where it was alcohol and caffeine in the same beverage, the reason why it got banned and why you can't sell drinks like this anymore is that it led to alcohol poisoning deaths. And the reason for that is that although, it's not that alcohol reduces sedation, it's that caffeine reduces sedation, but it does not mitigate alcohol-related impact on the body. So you're going to feel more energetic, but it's not like the alcohol isn't doing things to your central nervous system. It's not depressing your central nervous system, which means that your body's natural defense mechanism against alcohol poisoning, blacking out and passing out, is less likely to happen. Because, if you pass out, you're not drinking anymore. But if you are artificially keeping yourself awake so you can't pass out and you're choosing to drink more instead, that leaves the door open to alcohol poisoning. So it can lead to irregular heartbeat because your heart's being pulled in two different directions, dehydration, increased blood pressure, and alcohol poisoning. Mixing alcohol and caffeine also creates a greater chance of binge drinking, unwanted or unprotected sex, driving drunk or riding with a drunk driver, or sustaining alcohol-related injuries. So definitely from a health standpoint, something to avoid. A lot of dangers there, even on top of alcohol, which already has a lot of potential issues, particularly amongst young people. So what you're looking at here, this was a review that came out a few years back, looking at the impact on, actually they included both human and rodent models in terms of the cognitive personality variables. And what you're seeing down here are the consequences of exposure. So things like verbal learning deficits, memory deficits, attention deficits, as well as neural alteration. So a neural alteration is, the physical shape of the brain changing. And so, there have been some studies that were just done in rodents over there on the right, some that were done with humans. But you can see it absolutely affects both in terms of if you have this increased present and or this is worse the more you take in of alcohol as an adolescent, the sorts of impacts that you can expect on the brain and body, and it's not a good thing. And certainly chronic use is this whole other layer of problems. And alcohol is one of the most caustic substances that you can put into your body, in all honesty. It just burns its way through a lot of different body systems. So if you are, particularly again, if you're drinking to the point of intoxication, and there's more and more evidence coming out that even having like 1 or 2 drinks a day can have a negative overall impact on you, particularly if you're female. Actually, it's related to the development of breast cancer. But any benefits we're finding are arguably not present, and there might even be detriments, like there might be hidden costs to drinking even a small amount a day. But then what is a small amount? This is something also that young people aren't very aware of. So if they do choose to drink, and that's worth mentioning as well, like we'll talk a bit about how do you talk to your kids about this subject. And it's important to both, be very clear that your expectation and desire for their health is that they don't drink, because it is actually harmful to them. And if they did choose to do it, because some will, you're not going to be there, right? When they will have the opportunity in all likelihood, and they will have to make the choice for themselves. If they choose to make that choice, they also need to understand how to do it in a way that means that they're less likely to hurt themselves in like immediate ways, like education about drunk driving and not driving drunk, but then also about just knowing how much is going into your body and then what that does to you. Because again, a lot of times, because between the alcohol percentage being different and not understanding volumes, people can drink way too much and get themselves into trouble. So helping people understand, providing education on what a standard drink is, and then also then how that translates to BACs, both for, again, their own health, but also for driving, safety. Again, I'm not sure of the law in Alabama, but there are some states where, anything over 0.00 is for anyone under the age of 21, like say, for example, like a DUI, but just in terms of safety, right, on the road and crashing versus not crashing. You can see how little it takes if you're in a smaller body, right? Like take a look at like 100, 120 at 2 drinks. If you're 100 pounds, 2 drinks, you're at 0.12 BAC. And even if we get up to 140 pounds, like it's over 0.08 at 2 drinks. So this is something, again, with smaller bodies, it adds up very, very quickly. And again, what does that mean, right? Like how does that turn into negative things? Providing that education is very helpful. I should mention, I'll provide the slides. I think I actually forgot to send them in prior to the to starting today, so I'll make sure that I get those out. And then also when we finish during the Q&A, I'll go ahead and stick them in the chat real quick if you'd like to download them from there. But so don't leave if you'd like to grab a copy of the slides. But what it happens pretty quickly around, once you get over 0.08, that things start taking a turn and getting negative. And at 0.15 BAC, you're 380 times more likely to be in a fatal crash than if somebody was sober. And the average BAC amongst fatally injured drivers is 0.17. So again, and this is something if folks haven't been educated about this, it can be very helpful for them to get educated so they understand. Like 0.17 is right around 3 drinks for someone in a smaller body. And that's the average for people who die on the road driving cars, is at 3 drinks if they're taken in a relatively quick succession. So really just being aware of that is incredibly important. So some other alcohol FAQs, myths, facts that I just want to pass along to you here that you can potentially use leverage with your kids or kids that you talk to. Drinking on an empty stomach absolutely can be very volatile. I think that so this is something that's pretty well known, particularly amongst adults. But again, kids need to understand this. The reason why, of course, is that the alcohol goes straight onto the stomach lining rather than having to pass more slowly through food. And when it hits the stomach lining, it gets absorbed. And so you can poison yourself a lot more easily. You can be very intensely drunk a lot more quickly if you're drinking on an empty stomach. And so that's something ideally that is not done because it can lead to more consequences. Drinking more also doesn't lead to a better time necessarily. And this is something as well. There's a myth called there is a myth that the more you drink, that's this yellow line, like the more you drink, the better you're gonna feel. And like this is the sort of thing a lot of times that's portrayed in movies or just what kids think, like, oh, you're having a good time, like you drink more. But that's actually not the case. And there's something called the biphasic effect with alcohol, where what happens is that after a certain point, which is fairly early on actually, in drinking, things get bad and you start feeling worse while you're intoxicated. You start having consequences, like say if you're blacked out or stumbling, slurring your words, those sorts of things. And then you also then have a hangover the next day that you got to contend with that you would not have if you were drinking less. And so helping kids understand, right? Because people need to understand how to engage around these concepts, even if they're not doing it yet. That drinking more doesn't just mean a better time in general. And just as a quick FYI, obviously, no amount of alcohol is a good idea for a child, but just as a quick FYI, the BAC percentage that has been most consistently associated with positive feelings and lack of negative feelings later down the line is 0.05 BAC, 0.05. So just something to keep in mind. Again, it's not the best idea to encourage children to drink anything at all, much less to 0.05. But that's a much lower number, I think, than most people realize. But when you actually do the studies, it's drinking a bunch of alcohol is not related to having more enjoyment. So we actually already talked about this one. Alcohol leads to vomiting and blacking out because this is your body trying to save itself. Like you're literally ingesting poison. It's essentially what's going on. And so it's trying to, in every possible way, I shouldn't be blacking out actually. Ideally, it should be passing out. But vomiting gets the alcohol out of you. Passing out makes it so that you just can no longer take anything else in. But that's why it does that. You cannot expedite sobering up. There's all these like tricks and ideas and like you can do things that can increase alertness, right? Like that we were talking about stimulants. We were talking about caffeine. You can do that, but it's not going to actually sober you up. A breathalyzer would be exactly the same. The impairment is still there, even if you've got more faster processing speed. You still might not be taking things in accurately. So there's no way to expedite sobering up. There's just not anything that we found to do that so far. It's very difficult for someone to gauge also if they are too drunk to drive for a couple of reasons. One, your judgment's impaired. So it would make sense that you can't gauge how drunk you are. But the second is that actually we tend to find that our physical tolerance goes up faster than our mental tolerance. So a lot of times I find that people aren't aware that there's 2 different types of tolerance to alcohol. One is physically how much it affects you. The other is mentally how much it affects you. And so what happens is that physical tolerance tends to go up a lot faster than mental tolerance. So that's why if someone has a high tolerance, you might find that they are not slurring their words as much or they're not stumbling. Physically on the outside, they seem better. But cognitively, actually, they are impaired. oftentimes to a much greater degree than they're showing physically. And so that's another area where someone might think that they're fine because they are impaired cognitively. But from that state in particular, they're looking at their body and being like, well, I'm walking okay. I feel like I could probably drive a car. But you can't make that judgment. Really, it's really just about that number that's blown. And that's why, again, people get pulled over when, even with, say, alcoholism, where they might be able to have a BAC of, 0.3, 3.5, 4, even higher, and somewhat function. It's not safe to drive if you're at 0.15, or anything over 0.08. So lastly, just a quick note, little factoid that you might find interesting. So the LD50 of a substance is called a lethal dose for 50% of the population. And there's something called a therapeutic index, which takes this into account. The therapeutic index, what you do is you look at the ratio between the therapeutic amount someone would need to like feel the effect of the drug versus the LD50 of a drug. And so if we define alcohol's therapeutic point at 0.08, the LD50 for alcohol is 0.45. That's the LD50. So it would be like, so basically 6 times the effective dose of alcohol kills 50% of the people who use it. 6 times. That's outrageously dangerous, actually. There's like no prescription drug that would ever be approved with that low of a therapeutic ratio, where you could take 6 times the amount that you're prescribed and die. In all likely, like literally 50-50 shot, you make it out the back of that. Never would that get approved. It's outrageously dangerous. This would be like taking 12 Advil and dying. It's incredibly caustic. And so I think sometimes, again, like when we're talking about norming and how we talk about utilize alcohol versus, the policies that we shape around it versus all other substances, this is all about norms. It's all about what society has done, will do, and the fact that once you norm something like this, it's very difficult without shifting those norms to take it away. I mean, when you talk about why did prohibition fail, it wasn't because it wasn't helping people's health. It actually was. When alcohol wasn't being sold anymore, cirrhosis went down. There were a lot of public health indicators that got better, but people didn't want it. It was very normalized. It was part of society. It was part of life. It had worked its way in there. And so it wasn't a sustainable intervention, even if there were positive health consequences that were coming out of it. At that point, there wasn't anything that could be done. So, but just factoid about that, that it's actually a very, very dangerous drug. So that being said, let's pivot into the second part of today, which is what can we do about it? Because again, I think information is important, and hopefully you heard something in the first portion of the presentation today that you didn't already know and that you feel like you could potentially put to use. But we also need to think about what we can do about it. And I want to center it around this idea of renorming, but then also about conversations and how we talk with our kids. So talking about parental influence, truly what you say matters. And I know sometimes it doesn't feel like it, but there's a part of your child most of the time that does identify as being part of the family. That where you are their parents, and there's a part of them that actually does want to have a positive relationship with their parents, that wants their parents to be proud of them, that feels like they are a member of the family, even when things are a little bit more distant and they're trying to individuate themselves a bit in high school. That's still there. And so over and over and over again, parental expectations and what they say, Matt, is a very significant predictor of youth behavior. So you want to make sure that you set expectations. You want to provide then also information and true norms and health impact about alcohol. And, we talked a bit about the health impact side already. And, again, I think I saw a little bit of pop-ups from the chat about wondering about slides. Again, I will put those in the chat at the end of today, and I will provide them to Carrie. It's totally on me for forgetting to send them before, so that you don't have them in front of you right now, but you will get them. And you can use them to provide information about the true norms and health impact of alcohol. Well, this is actually very powerful, though, and I want to share. There was a study that came out in 2023 they were looking at university students for this, but it's the best depiction I could find. Great visuals on this. They did an intervention with university students, just simply renorming. And so that they were asking how many students binge drank in the past month. And then they gave them this individualized feedback. So if someone said 64%, I think that like 2/3 of college students drank in the past month. They plotted that here, but then they put the actual amount, which is 24% of college students say they've binge drank in the past month. And then they mentioned that fewer and fewer of people your age are binge drinking each year. And this number is expected to continue decreasing. And that is true. Actually, when it's not huge drops, but right, like it started up closer to 30%. And then by 2021, it was closer to 22%. So literally all I did was they grabbed the CDC data, they put it in front of them, plopped their guess, and showed them that discrepancy. And what they found, we'll come back to this drinking responsibly bit. But what they found was that here is their baseline and their 6-month follow-up. And here's the difference from that intervention in their perceived norms and then their behaviors. You can see that their thoughts about norms for drinks per week went from 17% to 9 is what they reported. Their norms for drinking frequency went down. The norms for the percentage who engaged in the past month basically that's like high volume drinking. And then the percentage who drove after drinking the past month after receiving normative feedback. And look at their own behavioral difference. The percent that abstained went up. Their drinks per week went down. Their drinking frequency went down. Their number of heavy episodic drinking went down. And their number and drinking and driving went down by 30% as well. Just from this type of feedback, where they were told what their guess was and what was actually happening, because we are so influenced by norms. And so this is something as well that you can do, right? You can talk. We had some of those graphs in the very beginning. There's great resources that are online for this as well, like from the CDC's website, NIAAA. But it's where if you can renorm, it can go a long way. You can also discuss what drinking responsibly means if they choose to drink, because again, kids tend not to know, how does BAC work? What would it actually be in your body? What's the implication of that on behavior, on your risk level, not just for drinking and driving, but for being in fights, sexual assault victim, all of these different elements, right? It's that we just really help them understand all of the risks involved. Because again, and I think I mentioned this on a later slide, the bottom line is they will in all likelihood have opportunities to drink. And they will have to make the decision about whether or not to do it on their own without you there. And so that's why you want to prepare them for that choice. Make it very clear that you expect them to be healthy. You hope that they will choose to be healthy and not do that. And you can talk about refusal strategies and ways to work through those challenging situations as well. But if they do choose to do it, they need to understand how to reduce the level of harm and danger. Because without that information, they can get themselves in a lot more trouble than less trouble. So in terms of parental influence, so what you say matters, but what you do also matters. So it's really important that you stay involved and connected with your child, because that way you'll know if they start to have a problem. If you don't know what normal looks like, you don't know when things are starting to get dicey. So I mentioned before about you want to get the taboos out of there. The phrase that I did not make up, but is a really useful phrase, is that 61-minute conversations are more impactful than one 60-minute conversation. It's not about having the talk. It's about staying in touch and not making it be like this big deal. And we'll talk more about just some ways to broach the subject if you've never done it before in a little bit. But if it's not a big deal, just check in with your kids about what they're seeing with vaping in their school, or with pot, with alcohol, weed, whatever the language is that they're using, right? Make sure to because very, very few kids are saying like, I want to go to the cannabis dispensary, right? That's not the verbiage that they use. But really trying to, again, don't make it awkward, right? This is, you're their parent, you're in charge of their health, keeping them safe, getting them to the age of 18, right? Until they're legally an adult is just a part of, checking in how things are going, making sure that you know what's going on in their world. So then thinking about also, what are you modeling? And we talked a bit about this already. Are you modeling a healthy relationship with alcohol? really bottom line. Like if you're modeling anything with alcohol, is it a healthy relationship, or is it something where they're starting to learn this is, like when you're an adult, this is how you relax. When you're an adult, this is how you have fun. Is that what they're taking away? So just being really thoughtful about that. You want to reduce the availability of alcohol in the environment. So really, again, making it not easy for them to just go take alcohol, not give it directly to them. Really just think about, where am I keeping this? How available is it? How visible is it? How normalized is this in my child's life? You want to make sure you get to know your teen's friends, because again, if you think about those four main areas, their peer group is so crucial in terms of what they choose to do. You ideally also then want to create consistent messaging and expectations from their friends' parents as well. So it's not like when they go over to their friend's house, they're seeing something very different with alcohol, or they're being offered something very different than alcohol. Obviously, can be awkward sometimes having those conversations. You've got to engage with that to your level of comfort. But the best success when we look at what kids do not get involved in negative alcohol related patterns are ones where their entire social ecosystem is fairly well aligned in how they approach alcohol and other drugs. So to that end, making sure also to supervise parties. So it's something not where like you just don't know what's going on in your basement, or parties are happening at your house when you're not home, those sorts of things. So just making sure that you have that there, because again, this is something that's become normalized within the culture in our society, is that when there's a party, there's alcohol, not just for kids, right? Like that's something where many parties involve alcohol. And so they start to think about that, and that's part of why it works its way in. So making sure that you're supervising, making sure that they have options for healthy activities and peer groups as well. And that's part of, again, being in touch and connected with your kid and getting to know your teen's friends. It's about, if you see like, wow, like this is a group of kids who tends apparently to drink a lot or that's using drugs, obviously really tough to to get your child to leave those people essentially, or not hang out with them when they're doing those things. What's a lot easier sometimes is helping provide them contact with different groups of kids that they may also like, and where you can start to shift things a little bit more slowly. Bottom line, though, you've got to be aware of it, because if they're getting more and more enmeshed, ingrained, and tight knit with a group of kids who are engaging in antisocial behaviors or just self-destructive behaviors, then you got a whole other pickle that you've got to unravel. If now they're doing it too, and they're identifying with it and seeing it as part of their lifestyles. So again, being connected as early as possible, educating as early as possible, and not letting it get entrenched really makes the hill towards better functioning a lot less steep than if you have to try to like roll all that back. And then don't provide alcohol, even in small amounts. Again, that goes very much against the data to do that. So there's a wonderful book. Now, in terms of how do you talk with your kids, have these difficult conversations, cannot recommend this book more strongly. The School of Hard Talks. What Dr. Emily Klein does in her book is take a theory of interaction called motivational interviewing, which we'll actually be talking a little bit about today in the few minutes that we have left. And she makes it very easy to understand and applies it exclusively to parents and parenting. And so just so much good information in that book. If you feel like you struggle to talk to your children about difficult conversations, or to discipline effectively, or to have those types of dialogues, pick up this book. It's worth it. But she's got a great little four quadrant graph in there about different types of parenting styles, and then what you might sound like. And ideally where you want to get to is this one on the top right, of you'll figure out how you want to handle this, and I'll help you figure out how to get there, right? But what we're going to talk about here is the idea that intrinsic decisions are the far and away the most impactful. When you decide to do something for your own reasons, which can be because you agree with your parents on something, or because you want a good relationship with your parents. But when your child decides for their own reasons why they say aren't going to drink, that will be far more effective than you just simply saying, you're not allowed to do it, or I'll be very angry if you do it. Again, setting expectations is important, but really trying to instill values is crucial, because otherwise, like, what happens when they leave the house, right? What happens when they go off to college, or if they graduate high school, just get their own place? If the only reason why they weren't doing something was because you were going to get mad at them, what's stopping them now, right? So we've got to think beyond just that first layer and think, how do we develop and foster an identity where the idea of binge drinking or having an unhealthy relationship with alcohol just does not sound appealing to them. Where they look at that and say that actually is harmful. That's self-destructive, and I don't want to be doing that. So that's ideally where we get to. Now, the bedrock of all of this is emotional safety between yourself and your child. And this is something where if you don't have it, it takes a little while to build, but you can build it. But if you are not safe, if your child doesn't feel like you're emotionally safe to talk to, they are not going to tell you about really sensitive, important topics like, say, drinking, or them worrying about other people drinking, or not knowing how to handle situations related to alcohol and drugs. So having an emotionally safe and secure relationship with your child is crucial. The way that you develop and maintain this is how you communicate with them. And there's a great acronym that the Center for Motivation and Change made up for this called Communicate with Love, which stands for listening, offering, validating, and empathizing. And these are the ways that you do it that we're about to get into. And if you can do these four things, it makes it a lot easier to develop, foster that relationship. So, how do we support and guide? First and foremost, before we get into each of those areas, we want to help teens explore their thoughts and feelings and come to their own conclusions, right? That's not to say that we're not going to offer guidance, and we'll talk about how, but again, coming to their own conclusions has a lot more staying power than if you're telling them what's going on, because you're oftentimes not going to be there. You want to empower their self-efficacy, their belief in themselves through autonomy. They get to make the decisions about their own life, right? And they ideally would want to make decisions that are the best for them as possible. And this is really critical because kids' lives are oftentimes out of their control. There's a lot of things that children have to do, rights that they don't have. There's structure that's created and laid out for them, which isn't to say that's a bad thing, but does mean that a lot of times when you look at some of the maladaptive behaviors that kids might exhibit, it's about creating a sense of control where they previously didn't have one. Eating disorders, like if you think back to that slide right at the beginning, right? Eating disorders, numbing out with substances, cutting behaviors, the pushback, right? Like if you're getting into power struggles with a teenager, a lot of it comes from the fact that they don't feel like they have control and they want to have control. It's very difficult to not be in control. So as much as you can give autonomy around decisions or frame this is going to be your choice. You are going to get to decide what you do. There's consequences, maybe even like household, family, relational consequences that might occur if you choose to drink. But it's your choice, and making sure that they know that they're going to have that choice. You want to make sure you resist something called the righting reflex, where you tell someone like, this is what you need to do, or this is the right thing to do. You can talk about your expectations. You can talk about what would happen if they don't follow your expectations, certainly. You can talk about the health, but you can't tell them. You can, of course, but if you start telling them what they have to do, what they need to do, what they're going to do, that's pushing, right? That's pushing and telling them what's right and wrong rather than letting them come to that conclusion for themselves, which doesn't have to require making mistakes, right? That's the school of hard knocks, right? That what the book was riffing off of. That's the idea, right? Make a mistake, take a hit, learn from the pain, learn from the discomfort, and get better. Doesn't always have to happen that way. But at the same time, we do have to give people room to make their own decisions, or that's when they tend to push back just for the sake of pushing back. So when we just go in and solve problems, that can actually come across as disempowering. So let's talk about the love model. The L stands for listening. And so specifically, when you are listening to somebody, you have to show them that you're listening. You can't take for granted that it's happening and that they know that you're listening. And the way that you do that is by actively listening. There's two ways to demonstrate active listening that work really well. And one of them is asking open-ended questions. Now, an open-ended question is a question that allows for exploration of motivation, thoughts, and feelings because it's broad. So a closed question would be something along the lines of, like, say you've got a child who is hopping in the car after school and you say, how was school today? Good. Or did you have a good day at school today? Yes. No. It was fine. Um, Closed, relatively closed. An open version of that question could be, hey, well, so what was the most interesting thing that happened at school today? Or what's something challenging that you're working through at school right now? That shows that you care when you do that, and it gives someone room to share, like that you care about the details of their life. And then when they follow up, obviously, you following up on that and showing that you're listening is really helps people feel more comfortable. So stems for open-ended questions are things like what, how, tell me more about, why. Sometimes you do have to be careful about, because it can come across as accusatory, like why do you feel that way? That sort of thing. Why did you make that decision? Instead of like, can you tell me a little bit more about why you feel that way? Or I still said why, but can you tell me more about how you feel? Or what's challenging about this for you? Like that. Those are open-ended questions that don't have the judgment quite as ingrained. Things to avoid are have, had, has, which, how many, did, do, does. Those sorts of things. Again, questions that just have really quick answers. You want to ask questions that allow for branching to occur, and where you can ask about multiple things and then show that you're listening. That helps someone feel really heard. The other type of listening technique, again, that you can leverage and really easily are called reflections. And a reflection is something where you're either reflecting back content or emotions to somebody using different words than they gave you. And that shows them that you're listening, because if you hear something, you get the meaning of it and you repeat it back to them in different words. That shows that clearly you understand them. And that's an experience. Worth mentioning as well, trust and safety, that's a feeling. And if you recall, feelings come from our limbic system. That's the dog behind the wheel of our car. And our limbic system doesn't speak English, right? It's not logical. It feels. And so part of the reason why the way we communicate is so important, even though we're communicating with words, is that we are all actually we're not telling someone that we're safe. We're showing someone that we're safe actively. It's an experience. And that's how our limbic system learns. It learns from experience, not from logic. Like, for example, if you've ever gone to like a new job and like your first day on the job, maybe you're a little nervous. You're like, am I going to like my boss? Am I going to be able to do well? Or my coworker's going to be all right? But then, maybe the first day's fine, and the second day you go back and you're not as nervous as you were on the first day, but maybe you're not like entirely comfortable, and maybe it takes like a week or 2 weeks before like all those like new job concerns and jitters have faded a bit. The reason why it fades is because you are experiencing that it's okay. You're experiencing that it's safe. That it's safe. You could have tried to talk yourself into it ahead of time as much as you wanted. Can't get there because, again, you don't talk yourself into a feeling. You experience your way into a feeling. And that's what this active listening is all about, is showing someone that you care about them. And that's why it's so effective for impacting someone's limbic system. Well, they're in the midbrain. So again, you can focus on content or emotions. You can reflect back, like if someone's just like emoting that they're frustrated or they're anxious, like if say you're talking to your child and she just seems really anxious when she's talking to you, if you just say like, hey, seems like you're really uncomfortable right now. Do you want to tell me about what's going on? That can be that shows that like you see her, right? Even though she didn't say it out loud, but you saying it out loud or putting that word, that label to it, that shows that you're paying attention, which goes a long way. I think I mentioned this on somewhere. It's somewhere around here, but it's okay if you get it wrong. Like if you reflect something back, is that coming? Here it is. No problem if you get something wrong. So it shows that you're trying. If you were reflecting something back and you don't get the answer quite right, or your reflection quite right, the person you're talking to will say like, no, that's not quite right, or no, it's this other thing, and then they'll usually try to clarify. But from a relational standpoint, that usually is still a-okay, because you clearly are trying, and that, from a support standpoint, goes a long way. Reflections, they encourage someone to go deeper into a subject. So when you reflect something back, like, man, you must feel so frustrated right now, or like what I think I hear you saying is that it's really tough that so many of your friends are drinking now, and that just puts you in a huge bind. You say something like that to your child, probably what'll happen is they'll elaborate more. You show that you're listening, and they'll go deeper into it, which usually helps them sort out their feelings. So that's how you use a reflection. The L stands for active listening. Now, the O of love is offering, and this one's really critical. I think there's a lot of information hopefully that's been useful and will be useful for you today, but this part might be some of the most impactful, this particular slide. So one of the traps that parents oftentimes fall into is this pushback dynamic where they're trying to tell their child what to do or what they did wrong or how to do something better, and their teen is just pushing back. They don't want to hear it. They want to be their own person. They've got all their own thoughts about it. They're just not going for it. The way to circumvent all of that, the way to sidestep it, is through something called a feedback sandwich. When you have feedback or guidance or advice to give, where you've got the middle of the sandwich, which is the advice, but you're sandwiching it between two slices of autonomy and choice. So the first slice is asking permission to give advice. And this can feel really weird if you're not used to doing this, to like literally say, hey, so I have an idea that might help. Do you mind if I share it with you? Literally could be as simple as that. Or like I went through something similar in my life. Can I tell you what worked for me? Would you like to hear it? If you ask, can I share this information? Then if your child says yes, then they just gave consent to hear it. They literally asked to hear the advice. It is the opposite of being pushy. Like there's just zero pushiness there because they consented, they were asked, and they said yes. Worth mentioning on this point though, excuse me, only ask if they actually have the ability to say no. Because if they say, you know what, I'm really not interested, and then you do it anyway, then that's super like disconfirming, right? Like it's very dismissive. That tells them, hey, like actually you have no control and your feelings don't matter to me. So don't ask if they don't actually have a choice and you actually have to tell them about something. That being said, what you can still do sometimes, even if they have to hear something, is you can sometimes let them control the time and have the consent over that. So like if you say, hey, can I talk to you about something? Like we really need to talk about how to handle the situation differently, whatever it is. And they say, I really don't want to do it. You can say, okay, well, so here's the deal. We have to talk about this at some point today. Doesn't have to be now. You tell me, when would be the best time today to do it? Sometimes that's appreciated. And again, that's a way of giving them some amount of control uh, without actually, like giving them the ability to just not have the conversation at all. But the first slice of bread is ask for permission. Then you offer the advice or the guidance, and then you follow that up by asking how they feel about it. And that's that second slice of autonomy. So just literally say, like, so what do you think? Possible? Do you think you could do it? That sound okay? You can even give explicit permission for them to disagree with you. You can say, like, if you don't agree, I really want to hear about it. Like I want to know how you feel. What happens then? Let's assume for a second that you actually had some good advice. What happens then is that you asked permission to share it, they gave consent, they asked for your advice, you gave it, and then they themselves out loud, out of their own mouth, agreed with it. And what we know from research is that when that sequence happens, kids are much more likely to actually do that thing after they're not in front of you than if you just kind of said, like, here's what you need to do, or here's what you need to know about this situation, or whatever it is, when they've got all of this potentially resentment and pushback or just non-receptiveness, let's say, and this completely sidesteps it. So that's the O. It's offering. How do you offer guidance and giving that feedback sandwich model a try? So the V stands for validating. And what this means is you can validate someone's emotions without validating their behavior. And this is really critical because this is where, like, if you've heard the difference between, say, guilt and shame, or if you haven't, guilt is when you feel bad about something that you did and can be very motivating. You don't like the feeling of being guilty. So you want to create something called cognitive dissonance, where your values and your actions are out of alignment. And when you feel cognitive dissonance, you usually either shift your values or shift your behavior. And generally speaking, it's easier to change your behavior than your values. So being able to just see and understand somebody, validate them, let them know, like, it's okay. Like if you say you're talking to your kid about if they were drinking, really understanding that it was probably coming from a very basic, understandable human place. Like, I just want to be accepted by my friends, or I just really wanted to just enjoy myself and I'm super stressed out, or whatever it is. Being able to validate that, who they are, goes a long way. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am someone bad. Shame can be very paralyzing. Guilt is very motivating. So validation helps get away from the shame. Not being understood also is the crux of many disagreements. When people like it's if you just have fights that just seem to never end or go on for a long time, it's usually because one or both parties don't feel validated. They don't feel understood, that they are understood emotionally, that their point of view is being understood. So if there's a way to validate the person or and also show someone that you understand, even if you don't agree with the point, but that you understand them, that goes a real long way. Telling someone that their feelings are wrong or that yours are right is a surefire way to remove emotional safety. Like if you've ever never has anyone ever been in a situation where someone told them that they were overreacting and they responded by going like, "You're totally right. I am overreacting. I don't know what I'm talking about. I need to just drop it. If I saw things your way, just everything would be better and easier." Like, no, never happens because that's a dismissal. So really trying to tell someone that their feelings are okay is a great way of moving things forward. And this is indirectly or directly telling someone their feelings are wrong does not help. You can validate that emotional motivation without validating the behavior. That part is really critical too. So to talk about empathy, I want to take just a brief moment. I know we got about 5 minutes left today, so we're getting right towards the end of our time. I think what I'll probably do is go over by just a couple minutes, so forgive me and stick with me if you can. We'll take it to probably 11:35 is when we'll finish with the content, maybe just a smidge beforehand. And then happy to stay a couple minutes after that as well for questions if you can make it too. But apologies for going over. I want to watch this quick video because I think it does a great job of explaining empathy and why it's so important. So let's watch this, and then we will come back together, talk about it.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, "I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed." And then we look and we say, "Hey, climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone." Sympathy is, "Ooh, it's bad, no. You want a sandwich?" Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." Yeah. And we do it all the time. Because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Super sweet, right? But it's true, actually. It's about connection. It's about being able to show someone and tell your child that like you get it, you get them, that you've been there, that you can make that connection, and that is just absolutely critical to emotional safety and being able to communicate that. So that's the love model. Active listening using open-ended questions and reflections, offering that feedback sandwich, validating someone's emotions and that they are okay, even if the behavior needs to shift, and then being able to show empathy. And I, again, borrowing that from Brene Brown, she was the person who was giving that talk. Be in the whole with them. Don't just write in and tell someone how to feel better. Lastly, have persistence and don't get discouraged if this doesn't change quickly. Changing emotions takes time. I mean, think back to that example we just talked about with the first week at work, right? It's not like the very first day you go in, necessarily you're feeling great afterwards. It takes a few exposures. And certainly if there's been a period of time where you have been more distant and have not had a lot of emotional safety in a relationship with a child, it takes a little bit of time and consistency where you show them that you're changing or that you've changed and that things are different and that they can be safe and it'll be okay. But keep it up, and that's what eventually gets you there. Now, there's a couple final additional conversation ideas for how to talk with your child about alcohol. First, start talking about this earlier rather than later, and then check in on a regular basis. The reason for this, though, if you have the time and the opportunity, rather, to do this early, is that it's a lot easier to set narratives and the understanding about substances early rather than having to fight against all of those social media and media factors that we looked at earlier in the presentation. If you have a child who already thinks that alcohol is how you relax, or to be cool you have to drink, or this is just what all high school students do and college students do, all these sorts of things that are untrue, but maybe they get that idea for very understandable reasons. Now you have to unlearn that, right? Now you have to teach over that, which is a lot more challenging than just giving them an accurate view of it from the start. So earlier rather than later is good. And then just checking in. What do they see? Now, in terms of how you open the topic initially, it's a lot easier to start with the generalities rather than being more personal. So that has to do with, like, you don't want to say, like, have you had anything to drink, or have you been drinking at parties, or even like necessarily like, do your friends drink? Like, ideally it's that one's a little bit better, but if you can just start general, right? Like, have you seen much alcohol around? Like, did your kids talk about it much at school? Did you see it at all? Has it been at any parties that you've been at? Just like those sorts of things. That's a lot easier for a teen to answer off the bat, right? Until like this becomes something that you just talk about sometimes. That's not that big of a deal. A lot easier to talk about that than be like, do your friends drink, right? Where they might feel protective and defensive, or have you drank, right? And they might be like, like deer in headlights sort of situation. You want to avoid that. So when you're first opening it up, particularly if it's at a point like if they're in high school and there's a more solid chance that they have encountered this, being more general so that they don't feel like they're betraying themselves, or that they're betraying their friends, or that they're going to get themselves in trouble, trying to ease into it. You also want to seek first to understand, if you heard that phrase before. So listen, right? Like, ideally, when you ask that question and you find out about what's going on in their world, or even asking them, like, do you have any concerns or questions about like alcohol, substances? Like, what do you want to know? Just putting that out there. They might have different concerns than you do. They might have experienced things that you didn't know that they experienced, and really just giving them space and showing them that you want to understand them, not that you're just there to judge them or there to tell them what not to do or how they're, whatever it is. That goes a long way towards creating that safety and opening that dialogue. You also want to make sure when you talk about it that you talk about all sides of the alcohol and not just the negatives. So that means, like, yeah, if you just say like alcohol just like puts you at danger of like driving drunk and dying and getting in fights and being part of a sexual assault in some way, shape, or form, like if you're just talking about the negatives, there's going to be this piece where they're wondering like, well, what isn't my mom or dad telling me? Because why would people do it if it was just all bad? Or why do I see this in some shows? Or why does it seem like people have a good time? So being able to actually talk about the full construct, right, and not treat kids like they have to be handled in some way, or like if you just say that, yeah, like for some people there are some positive effects, but it comes with a lot of danger and brain health issues. Like, you can give them all the information, and it really is okay. Trying to keep the part away that there are positive potential euphoric effects from it. Then it actually lowers your standing, right? Because they know that you're not being straight with them, like you're holding some stuff back. So ideally, you want to connect alcohol-related decisions to your child's personal values. And again, this isn't for like your first conversation necessarily. You can see where it goes. But basically, when you think about what leads to lasting decisions over time, when you're not looking over their shoulder, a lot of that has to do with your child knowing who they want to be, what they value, and then mapping that behavior, drinking at parties or drinking underage and breaking the law potentially, does that map onto the person they want to be, and really making it clear, helping them see that it's clear that that doesn't align with their values, hopefully, right? Like if that, if it does, then I guess it's a different conversation. But if it doesn't, then really helping them see like, wow, like this behavior really doesn't align with the person you want to be now or in the future. Based on your own values, then when they're in that situation and they see it, they're like, yeah, like this really doesn't sit well with me. Like this wouldn't sit well with me if I did it. And you really want to lean into empowerment and personal choice when you're having those questions. Like they're not going to choose not to drink because you're going to ground them for a month. They're going to choose not to drink because that's not the person they want to be, because that's not the behavior that they want to engage in, because it doesn't align with their values. That makes sense. So that being said, what can I do if I think my child needs more help? Just very briefly about this. If you see that they're struggling or they've got an issue with substances, first stop, in my opinion, always should be connect with a therapist about it. Ideally, one with a certification in addiction-related concerns. Ideally, also one who works fairly regularly with teens or young adults. Therapy directories are a great place to start for this, particularly one of these two, Mental Health Match or Therapy Den. They kind of give you just folks who seem like good matches for what you're looking to do. Psychology Today is fine, but literally everyone's in there. So it's very hard to filter effectively. I found massive lists, not that you can't use it to find a therapist, but it's just so large and they don't do the best job, in my opinion, of filtering. But that's where you can find it. Quick note as well about this. It is totally okay to work with a therapist. Doesn't mean that you are like a bad parent or have done a bad job. I think a lot of times parents will hold off on getting their kid help when ultimately they really need it because the trajectory doesn't look so good. If you panned it out for another 3 to 5 years, because they're worried like it's some referendum on them as parents. It really isn't. There's so much, unfortunately, that's out of our control as parents. And if the trajectory of your child doesn't look good from a behavioral health perspective, it's absolutely worth doing something earlier rather than later. If there's an emergency, though, always, like if someone's in imminent danger, call 911. We also have 988, which is the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, which absolutely can be used for substance-related or alcohol-related concerns as well. That connects you to, I don't know if it's actually a licensed therapist, but it's at very, very least a specially trained person who's like a crisis line operator who will help figure out resources, will talk with you, will help someone navigate through that situation. So just worth having that in your back pocket as well. So take homes for today, and again, thanks for sticking with me a couple minutes late here, you guys. Unhealthy coping, including alcohol use, comes from discomfort, and all behavior has a purpose. Understanding the why behind use is really critical to helping someone change it. Emotional coping and peer influence are primary factors around why kids say they choose to use, but more specifically, alcohol-related norms, both those descriptive ones and the injunctive ones. So what do you think other people are doing and how acceptable is this behavior? They are really key predictors of youth alcohol use. So this can come from family, friends, media, and social media. Parents can stay connected, actively set norms and expectations, and help shape those peer influences through the peer groups that you expose your child to. They can cultivate emotional safety by communicating with love, and that's about listening actively, sandwiching feedback inside of autonomy, validating emotions, and the person underneath the behavior, and show empathy. And lastly, you can provide additional resources if your child is struggling. So thank you guys again so much for your time and attention today. If you have questions, drop me a line. I'm at aaron@winerphd.com, or connect with me on social media, particularly, as Carrie was mentioning, on LinkedIn, because that's where I tend to hang out the most.